question. But of course, we have to respect jurisdiction of provinces and territories. It's important that we share the financing of infrastructures. There's a lot of money to invest. I give you the example in Quebec. 4 years ago, we had a program over 10 years of $100 billion. We now have a program of $150 billion. So it's an increase by 50%, and we still need more. So we still need the help of the federal government, but we think that it should respect our jurisdictions.
Well, when it comes... Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Go ahead. Well, when it comes to housing, I always look for cooperation and collaboration with all three levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal, and any help the federal government can give us. I'm all open to any ideas that they have. I just want to remind everyone, 504,000 people landed in Ontario, fastest growing jurisdiction in all of North America, bar none. And what comes with the housing is infrastructure. We have to focus on infrastructure right across this country, and no matter if it's the roads or the bridges, infrastructure in Ontario, the 413, the Bradford bypass, and many other highways that we're building. So we look forward to partnering with all three levels of government.
I would just add to that as well, when and why I think, to explain a little bit of the discussion around the table that we had over the last day or two, and including today, as it pertains to infrastructure, and why we landed with calling for a First Ministers meeting dedicated to infrastructures, is really three areas where infrastructure is vital. The first is community infrastructure. So how are we going to move forward with the ISIP program, the gas tax program, ensuring that there is enough flexibility for municipalities to address the needs that they have wherever they may be in the nation, and those needs may be different from coast to coast to coast. The second focus of infrastructure would be economic infrastructure, our ports, our corridors that are coming into those ports. That last 50 or 100 miles into the Port of Vancouver, for instance, does require investment, and I think that's a broader conversation that we need to have with the federal government and all of those that are impacted by our various ports across the nation. And last and certainly not least would be the competitiveness that we need to retain in this nation. We are in Canada now competing against the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, and we saw some announcements here just in the past couple of weeks in Ontario. There's investments in the critical minerals, the rare earth elements, the rare earth space as well across the country, and we need to ensure that we are investing in keeping our nation competitive with whatever that environment may be, and that environment is proving to change rather rapidly over the course of the last 3 years. So I think there needs to be flexibility in each of those areas, and to have a conversation at the First Minister's table on, how are we going to fund those community infrastructure needs, those economic infrastructure needs that we have, as well as ultimately keeping our economy competitive and keeping Canada competitive with whatever the situation is that we face.
Bonjour, Thomas Laberge pour la presse canadienne. Monsieur Legault, je reviens avec la question de Bombardier qui a dû être discutée aujourd'hui. Il y a eu un communiqué.
So the Bombardier question that probably was discussed. There was a communique that was emitted with Mr. Ford. Are we to understand that the consensus you were looking for on Monday you did not manage to receive? Well, first, it is important for us in Quebec that we allow Bombardier to be able to bid. We're not asking for the contract to be granted to them, but we're saying that before signing any contract with Boeing, which is a U.S. company, we should let Bombardier the opportunity of bidding to replace those airplanes. There are repercussions that are quite significant in Canada. We're talking here about 22,000 jobs, including 6,000 in Quebec. So on our own end, we are quite clear. Now, I will let my colleagues answer any of your questions. On the meeting on infrastructure, how much are you asking on the part of the federal government?
à l'étape de chiffrer nos
We're not at the stage of having a specific number, but for the example of Quebec, for example, when I arrived in 2018, we had what we call a
sur 10 ans.
Quebec infrastructure plan, the PQI, of 100 billion.
Passé à 100
We even have brought it to 150 billion now, so an increase of 50%.
ces montants
So, of course, those amounts
la dette
increase
au Québec. Donc, c'est
the debt in Quebec. It is therefore important that the federal government participate more to the funding of infrastructure, whether it be in education, in health, in transportation, including public transportation, as well as housing. So what we would like is to have a meeting a little bit like what we had on health with the Prime Minister of Canada, to be able to all talk together about how to respond to these very pressing needs.
Good afternoon, Premiers. What concrete solutions did you come up with in these meetings to deal with Canada's housing crisis?
So I'll start off and I'll pass it off to some of my colleagues who I know will want to respond to this. Certainly we had a great discussion on all infrastructure needs today. We did have a discussion yesterday about housing specifically, but today was really focused on strategic and competitive infrastructure, things that will go towards growing our economy. But I can tell you, and what we need to do is have a First Minister's meeting to have those discussions with the Prime Minister, and we'll continue to move in that direction. I can tell you that those were the focuses of today's meeting. Again, yesterday we did address housing as well, which is very, very important to all of us across the country. Of course, we have our own unique needs based on whatever jurisdiction that we come from, and so that's very important to all of us as well. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in. Go ahead, David.
Thanks, Heather. One of the really important pieces about our infrastructure conversation today was when we talk about strategic infrastructure, we included community infrastructure. And that community infrastructure in British Columbia means that we're able to build more housing. And one of the big constraints we have economically in British Columbia is insufficient housing for the jobs that we have available in the province. Having a national strategy around infrastructure that includes things like community infrastructure, as well as those pieces that we traditionally think of, the highways, the ports, the railways, is so important. So the solution that we really came to at the table is we need to have an integrated national approach to this essential infrastructure that's going to support pieces like housing. You can't pull one piece out without having a conversation about all of this infrastructure. And the provinces, we can get so far on our own without the federal partner at the table. We can put the strategies in place that work for our provinces, but we need that federal partner at the table as well. And that's what led to the call. It's related to housing. It's related to economic growth. It's related to energy security. Infrastructure links all of these things and makes them possible. And that's why I'm really enthusiastic about this call, the First Minister's meeting, that I certainly expect the Prime Minister will be receptive to because it's in the national interest and it's certainly in our provincial interests.
And just a reminder to media, please state your name and the outlet.
Hi, it's Chris Rashowi from the Toronto Star. My question's for Premier Ford. Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow was sworn in today. She's already said that she's willing to take the province to court over Ontario Place. She's called the province and the federal government reluctant partners in funding for the city. And I'm just wondering what you think of these comments and what you expect your working relationship with her to be like.
The comments are disappointing. Already first comments that we're going to court. Well, anyways, I work with anyone I've proved. I'll work with anyone. I have a great relationship with Andrea Horvath, a former NDP leader. I have a great relationship with Stephen Del Duca. They both ran against me. And I just believe in working collaboratively together. We need housing in Toronto and the GTA and right across Ontario. We'll build the 1.5 million homes. That's what we should be focusing on, not necessarily Ontario Place, because on a level of 1 to 100 for people around our entire province, I'll tell you, they won't be talking about Ontario Place. They'll talk about affordability, how they can pay the bills, pay their mortgages. That's what's important to people, not only in Toronto, but across Ontario. And we have a very aggressive plan. We're building the largest transit project in North America in Toronto and the GTA, over $30 billion, 4 lines. And let's just talk the Ontario line. Just one line alone will take 10,200,000 cars off the road throughout 365 days a year. So that's what we're going to be focusing on, and hopefully she'll be open-minded and work collaboratively with us.
Bonjour, Sébastien Desrosiers de Radio-Canada. Ma question est pour vous, Monsieur Legault.
Sébastien Desrosiers from Radio-Canada. Mr. Legault, I understand about Bombardier, the request that you are phrasing, Mr. Ford and yourself, but what have your colleagues told you? I understand that they're not necessarily in agreement with you, or at least not enough to include that question in the final communique. And we are sometimes under the impression that your discussions are just a list of demands that you have for Ottawa. So what is the utility of the Council of the Federation? Is it always to ask for more on the part of the federal government?
Je pense que sur
I believe that on a lot of different subjects, we agree
priorité, comme aujourd'hui,
on the priorities. Like today, we're saying, well, the priority really is infrastructure. So there is a consensus.
dossier
Of course,
certaines, là, puis
for certain of us, and I will let people answer as they will,
délicat parce que
there are subjects that are more delicate because there are Boeing jobs in certain provinces and Bombardier jobs in other provinces. But I do believe that our request
est rationnel, c'est de
is rational,
ben,
and that is to say, let
les entreprises, incluant
all companies, including Bombardier,
une proposition.
bid.
Ça sera au gouvernement fédéral de regarder.
And it will be up to the federal government to look at them and see who has the best price, who has the best quality in terms of the product, and to also look at what the economic consequences can be in the different provinces. But I can fully understand, I think anybody could fully understand that those who have Bombardier plants in their province, well, perhaps
de ceux ou celles qui ont une usine.
they will wish for different things rather than those who have a Boeing plant in their provinces.
Hi there, Jack Helen from the Trillium. This is for Premier Ford. With the First Nations-led lawsuit over the Ring of Fire, and with Minister Wilkinson saying yesterday that there are much better areas to focus on for these types of projects, has your government overhyped what it can deliver on the Ring of Fire, and can you trust that the feds actually want this to happen?
Well, Minister Wilkinson sent us a letter committing to $40 million to putting a committee together, so I'm not too sure his message the other day or yesterday, but once you get a letter and say you're going to put $40 million into it, we'll have to have our folks talk to the PMO's office. But, the world is watching, and we need to perform. Global investment is watching, and we need to move forward with the Ring and Fire in cooperation with First Nations community. Again, the two First Nations community, Webequie, I should say, and Martin Falls are doing the environmental assessment. This will bring prosperity and growth to communities right across the north, and helping First Nations communities, no matter if it's the road that we've committed over $1 billion to bring proper health care to these communities, to bring proper energy to these communities. It's going to make their lives better. But I always believe in sitting down with all 9 First Nations communities to discuss opportunities and profit sharing that they will see directly into their community.
Janice McGregor from CBC. The Atlantic premiers came into this meeting in writing with a demand for some kind of an offset from the federal government for the additional cost of clean fuel regulations and some of the other climate policies that have imposed a lot on consumers. I know other premiers up and down the table from different regions had also expressed some support for that idea for various reasons. But I don't see in this communique a unified call for that offset from the federal government. It says you discussed it and you expressed some concerns, but there isn't sort of a specific ask of the federal government on that. I'm wondering if if I'm correct in interpreting that there wasn't unanimity then at the table on this point, And if not, why not? Or if anyone can help make sure I understand the discussion correctly as it pertained to that.
Well, I mean, I can speak to it for quickly, and then I'm sure the other Atlantic premiers will want to weigh in. There's energy issues across all jurisdictions, and when we speak as a unified voice, we would like to raise the conversation so that is a Canadian approach and not necessarily just a regional approach. But there was a robust conversation amongst Atlantic premiers voicing our concerns with respect to the energy issues that we face on clean fuels. And if we can just dissect that for a second, you have the carbon tax, which is one issue, and the federal government is committed to giving that back to families and those in need. The clean fuels is a separate issue for Atlantic Canadians, and there is no offsetting or mitigating strategy being proposed by the federal government to date. We made sure that that was recognized across the table. Everyone agreed that that had a significant impact on Atlantic Canada, a differential impact on Atlantic Canada, in my province 3 times as much as many of the other people who are sitting across the table today. But each of us have our own energy issues as we move through this time of transition. This one particular is specific to the region of Atlantic Canada because of fuel security with respect to monopoly or duopoly with respect to supply, which is why we have a regulated environment. And as you've heard me say before, I think the policy, while conceptually perhaps sound and wanting to burn cleaner fuels, was not nuanced enough to ensure that it didn't have punitive impacts to people in Atlantic Canada. And that, I think that message was heard across all provinces, but we also as a region heard the other energy issues that are being faced with respect to electricity and greening of the grids across these. So we didn't want to pull that out as a specific provincial or regional issue, but it is embedded in there more broadly as an energy issue.
Yeah, and I guess I would follow up on that as to say that we will be meeting with the federal Atlantic Canadian ministers as the Council of the Atlantic Premiers in Moncton next week. This will certainly be on top of that agenda. We're trying to have a meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister. We're trying to negotiate the term or the time when we can have that meeting. But I think this particular issue for Atlantic Canada is reflective of other issues that take place in other jurisdictions across the country, whether it's Alberta with their challenges around resources, where we feel there's a disconnect in the conversations that we're having at the federal level. You know, there's always will be disagreements. There will always be things that we will be disappointed in when decisions are finally made. In this particular case, we don't feel it's been an unfair ask to delay the implementation of this until we understand the full impacts. And what we have when it comes to clean fuels is an interpretation of the rules and regulations that have been put in place by the federal government are now resulting in an increase at the pumps in Atlantic Canada, where we're all already paying some of the highest prices, certainly in the country, but in our history. We have said to the federal minister time and again, this is what everyone is saying is going to happen, including the parliamentary budget officer, the independent officer of Parliament, who said this was going to happen. And some bureaucrat or some bureaucratic approach in Ottawa is interpreting it a different way, saying this shouldn't happen, and now it's happened. And this, I think it's a frustration that all premiers over various levels at different times have felt with our challenge with trying to deal with the federal government on these issues. These are important issues, pocketbook issues that are hurting Prince Edward Islanders, they're hurting Atlantic Canadians, and we don't need to go down this road because we have been willing partners in trying to come up with a cleaner, greener environment for all of Canadians and all of Atlantic Canadians. So that's our frustration.
Is anyone else up and down?
Yes, thank you. I think that, you know, we've seen certainly the increases that we're having in inflation. We're seeing the impacts that it's having across the country. And as expressed by my colleagues, we're seeing certainly a greater impact in areas of Atlantic Canada and certainly in rural areas. And there doesn't seem to be any recognition of that. So it just seems to be a pile-on of additional costs. And then wondering, well, why are we seeing the inflation? Why are we seeing, you know, bank rates now continuing to climb to try to control that? Why are we seeing such a mitigating or an ongoing escalation of prices in every commodity? And so with a kind of an ideology of moving towards a cleaner, greener environment. It's the practicality of living every day with those changes. So while it's exacerbated in Atlantic Canada, and that's the voice of myself and my colleagues, it's a case of let's get some recognition for the impact this is having on everyday lives. We're all experiencing, as we talked earlier, about housing increases. We're seeing demands in that regard that we haven't seen before in Atlantic Canada. So it's unique time, but it's a time to recognize the reality. And our voice is consistent in that reality in Atlantic Canada. It's real, and we need the federal government to hear it.
I would add in just shortly as well with respect to the fact that whether it's federal government or any of the folks, the provincial leaders, territorial leaders that are here today, or Canadians in general, we have the same goal in mind. You know, whatever it is that we do produce, do in our daily lives, we're all looking to have a lower impact on the environment, in particular when it comes to the emissions that we are involved with in producing the products that we do and living our lives as we will. However, when you layer on policy after policy after policy, there's costs to those policies, and they need to be realized, and they're real, and they're being felt by Canadians now. And we should most certainly have a broader discussion as to what those costs are, what is achievable ultimately, and how we're going to get there in different areas of the nation. Because we're at different places, we have different needs in order for us to, to make the adjustments that we need to make over the course of the next while. The clean electricity regulations, for example, are another layer cost that's coming. We've identified in Saskatchewan that cost to which we can achieve a net zero by 2035, but the cost to attempt to achieve would be about an additional $8 billion just in stranding assets. And so that's a cost that will show up to ratepayers, largely to those that maybe are using electric heat, which are largely in our northern and Indigenous communities. And so there needs to be, I think, a broader consultation, a broader conversation with the federal government, not only on infrastructure, but eventually on the layering of these policies, the effectiveness of these policies, and maybe some back and forth on some provincial plans that are being put forward, and ultimately how effective can they be. And there's room for conversation around all of this, but there's also costs that we need to be discussing as well. The cost of what the largest oil producing province in this nation is facing as they look at carbon capture and storage on many of their projects is in the tens of billions. That cost is going to arrive either in a lack of competitiveness to one of the largest economic engine industries in this nation, or it's going to land at the fuel pumps for each of us when we are going to fill up our own vehicles, or, and likely, is going to also land with continued inflationary pressures that we see for items, for example, at the grocery store.
The problem with the federal approach is it's all stick and no carrot. And in the United States, it's the reverse. They want the investment in green technology, and they want to encourage businesses to do that, to create jobs and to grow. And I think that's what the statement says out of the premiers here, is that, yeah, we can meet green energy standards, we can meet emissions targets, but we have to have growing economies. The federal government has to step up and do its job, as opposed to keep on interfering in our jurisdiction to tell us how to do our job. Their job is to build economic corridors. Their job is to build ports. Their job is to give us new access through rail lines, through roadways, and to build transmission lines and to build a pipeline so that we can get our product to market. Because if each one of us is able to get our products to market, grow our economy, then we have the means to be able to invest in the technologies that will allow us to reduce emissions. But if they continue piling on top of our consumers and piling on top of our businesses additional costs, creating an affordability crisis and interfering with our ability to do those kinds of expansions and those kinds of investments, we just end up with a downward spiral in the wrong direction. So I think what I was pleased to see out of this this communique today is that everyone committed to things like Article 6. That's the Paris Accord section that Catherine McKenna negotiated when she was at the table to allow for us to use our technology to reduce emissions globally and our energy to reduce emissions globally and get credit back here. That's one of the ways in which we can reduce emissions but still do it in a way that helps enhance our competitiveness and enhance our exports. And that's we're just trying to encourage the federal government to think a little bit more creatively about how we can have both. Norway has managed to figure out how to have both. The Americans have managed to figure out how to have both. We are just asking for them to understand that they have put us in a position of creating an enormous affordability crisis because they keep on loading up cost after cost after cost, and they're not doing the work that needs to be done to make sure that we've got access to markets.
I want to conclude. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I think what I would.
I've picked a scab here, haven't I?
Well, no. But you're on an important topic because as Atlantic premiers, we've been warning, trying to work with the federal government for quite some time, saying that this would be harmful and it would be immediately harmful, and it was and is immediately harmful, and it's hurting families. So you know, we shared the impact with our fellow premiers there. There's broad, as you can see from the response, they understand and have similar concerns. So I would say that there was unanimity around the impact that it would have and how it's harmful. So as Atlantic premiers, you know, we want the federal government to also understand. And we're not done trying. We'll try again next week with the Atlantic members of parliaments and have a direct conversation with them in Moncton, because they should also see it from their own constituents. The question will be whether they have the courage to speak up about what they see, and I hope they do.
And I just want to make sure that it's not interpreted as some are trying to project it into a false dichotomy. Either we subscribe to this or we don't believe in climate change. That's not what we're saying as Atlantic premiers. Certainly, we all want to do our part. For me, in a federation, this is a question of fairness and all of us doing our equal part. And so I don't want the argument to devolve into a simplistic one of this false dichotomy, which I think has been projected unfairly at times.
And I think I'd like to add to that, and it kind of addresses back to the question that was asked further earlier about what is the purpose of the Council of the Federation. You'll find in communiques there are a lot of the provinces and territories will agree on items, and then they'll have differing examples of what they're experiencing in their own jurisdictions. So when we come to the Council of Federation, it's finding the areas that we can all agree 100% on and speaking as one voice, bringing it to the federal government. Again, you know, for example, carbon tax in the South might be okay. It might be an initiative to get people off of diesel, dirty, moving to clean energy. But in the North, it's a punishment for us because we have no options. There is nothing else except diesel. So, of course, that's what I'm saying, is that you have to find common ground and to be able to speak as one voice. The other reason for Council of Federation, it's not only to look to attack the federal government. We're small jurisdictions in the North, and so it's important that for us that we work with other jurisdictions so that we can learn things from them. We can share some of their supports that they have. We can share our experiences. I remember a few years back, all of the premiers across the table, we worked on mental health, and we were looking at best practices across the country. So the purpose is because we are one as Canada. And no jurisdiction should be isolated if we think of us all as Canadians. So I rely heavily on the Council of Federation to be able to support my population.
Good afternoon, Rosanna Hempel with Global Winnipeg. With a question for Premier Stephenson, others are welcome to weigh in. The federal government is promising to review contract policing and the RCMP contract expiring in 9 years. Are the provinces clear or concerned about what Ottawa intends to do when it comes to the role of the RCMP, especially when it comes to community policing?
Yes, thank you for the question, because we did have a very good discussion about this, and I know some of my colleagues will want to weigh in on this. We're very concerned because there is no indication what the federal government's plan is moving forward with respect to the RCMP. And I can tell you in some of our jurisdictions, including here in Manitoba, the RCMP, we rely on the RCMP for delivering those services outside of Winnipeg. And so it is concerning about what the future is. The federal government is responsible for negotiating the contracts. We don't have a say in that, but the costs are escalating as well. And one of the other challenges that we identified is the vacancy rate, which is significant in certainly in Manitoba and in other jurisdictions across the country. And so we want to make sure that they're very clear about what their plan is moving forward with respect to policing, and they need to come forward and be sooner rather than later when it comes to that. I don't know if any of my colleagues want to jump in there as well.
They do seem to send a mixed message about whether they're committed to maintaining contract policing. And so it's left some provinces like ours where we are expanding out our sheriffs in anticipation that they may not want to continue expanding the service. And so we're hopeful that they'll be a little bit more clear, because when you see all of the vacancies that we have, I was surprised to hear how significant they are in some of the other provinces. That almost looks as if the force is being wound down just through attrition. And if that's not the intention, then they should be fairly clear about what it is. Because if it is their intention, then the provinces who do rely on RCMP have to develop other services, have to do more training, have to do more recruitment, and that takes time to do all of that. So I would just encourage the federal government to be quite clear about what it is that they have in mind. It was in Marco Mendocino's letter, but we haven't really had those open discussions, so we don't really know what the intentions of the federal government are.
For British Columbia, it was remarkable for me to hear from colleagues across the country the level of vacancies that they're seeing in their RCMP forces as well, and how it's impacting public safety, just like it is in British Columbia. We have officers that have to work extended shifts that are increasingly strained and stressed, and then going off on leave, making the problem worse. We don't see a clear path from the federal government about filling those vacancies. We have the largest RCMP contract force in Canada. There's a clear direction from the Prime Minister to his Public Safety Minister to start the conversation with premiers. The contract as a whole is up in the early 2030s, and we need to know which direction the federal government is going with contract policing, because the current situation is not sustainable for British Columbia, and one of the benefits of being around this table is I get to hear from other provinces and territories as well, and similar concerns coming from colleagues, and that's why it's in the communique, is we need that clarity from the federal government.
And I guess if I just add one other point to that, is this is all happening at a time when we're seeing increased crime rates across the country. So it becomes even more critical to get clarity on not only the future of the RCMP, but on options that we collectively could have in each province. So it's the timing is important to get a decision.
Lindsay Gay, Radio-Canada. My question is for Premier of Manitoba. What's your plan to improve the competitiveness and to fight against inflation here in Manitoba and also in Saskatchewan?
Thanks very much. And my focus and our focus as a government has been on making Manitoba competitive across the country. That's why I've set up an advisory group to advise us on that. But I can tell you, we're already, through our clean green hydroelectric power, attracting businesses to Manitoba that would never have normally looked at us before. Given the situation that's happening around the world, we're in a unique position here to be able to attract those businesses. So we will continue to put in place making sure Manitoba is competitive, not just across the country, but around the world, and also ensuring that we find a way to get our goods to market, which is why we're calling for this First Minister's meeting with the Prime Minister to ensure we can sit down and talk about what it means for a national trade corridor infrastructure strategy. And that's going to be absolutely critical moving forward, making sure that we can get our goods to market We've gone from being, I think, 10th in the world to number 32 or 38 or so. It's significant, and we need to make sure that we're putting that valuable infrastructure in place to get us back, not just to 10, but hopefully higher than that. And so that's really our vision, our strategy in Manitoba to make sure that we're competitive with other jurisdictions.
The inflation, to fight against inflation.
The fight against inflation, yeah. Again, that's all about being competitive as well. We know that the inflationary pressures are very significant on Manitoba. It's not unique to Manitoba. Others may want to comment on this as well. But we did put various plans in place in the short term to make life more affordable for Manitobans, but we also have looked at making sure that our taxation is competitive across the country. We simply had fallen very far behind there, and we want to ensure that we're making an environment in Manitoba that's conducive to growing our economy. We know if we're growing our economy, that's better for not only to provide better supports in the way of healthcare, education, social services, but it also makes life more affordable for Manitobans.